Matthew Matt with the second part of my video on the Common Core Mathematics in the kindergarten grades. So as a reminder, there are two main areas: number, which you get most of the emphasis, and describing shapes and space. So that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. When kids are exploring with shapes, they really should see a broad range of shapes. I don't even have as many as I wish I had, as I wish I could fit on the screen here, but a whole bunch of different kinds of shapes. Not just the ones we might typically see in the classroom or in especially a lot of children's books where we just see sort of the normal or common shapes. They need to see all kinds of shapes. So when they learn what a triangle is, that they really understand what makes it a triangle as opposed to looking a particular way, like a very specific kind of triangle. So you should make sure they're exposed to a lot of different shapes. The Common Core is also talking about 3D shapes at this point, and these might be harder to find around the house, but if you have some cylinders or some cubes or balls or things like that, then that's a way for them to start to explore 3D shapes and also think about talk about how 3D shapes are different than flat two-dimensional shapes. Another common tool in the classroom and in math classrooms is pattern blocks. If you have a set of these or want to order a set of these, you can just search for pattern blocks. We have a nice kind of magnetic set, so our kid can put them on a white sort of magnetic whiteboard and make different designs, which is fun. But there's also, I have a link here and I'll put it in the description below for an online way to access the pattern blocks. So what are some different things you can do with shapes? First off, as I said, you want to give a variety of shapes whenever possible, not just typical ones. One game is to pick two shapes and talk about how they're similar and how they're different. Maybe you pick two, maybe your kid picks two, maybe you each pick one, but you know, what's the same about these shapes? What's different about them? The emphasis here isn't on right ideas necessarily or the answer per se, but it's just about what do they notice, what are they seeing, and you could share your own thoughts and expose them to other ways of looking at it. Just keep in mind that the emphasis is more on exploration and talking about the kids' thinking, not finding correct answers per se. You might say, here's a bunch of shapes. Why don't you pick some that you think all go together? Put them all in a pile or a group together, and let's talk about why you chose those ones. Why do they go together? Maybe the adult wants to make a group of shapes and say, you know, what do you think I was thinking? What do you think my idea was for how to put these shapes together? You might want to keep it pretty simple with things that kids are ready to start talking about this level, like just picking all the triangles or all the shapes with 5 sides or something like that. So they might start to notice some of those properties of shapes. Finally, you might make designs or bigger shapes out of smaller shapes. If you search online for pattern block puzzles or things like that, there's all kinds of examples of how you can take those pattern blocks and try to sort of fill in a outline. Another common tool would be tangrams. But the big idea here is thinking about how we can make shapes, especially larger shapes, out of smaller shapes, how we can put shapes together and take them apart in different ways. Another thing that we do a lot is to, say, walk around the home or neighborhood and say, where do you see examples of shapes? So that the door looks kind of like a rectangle. It reminds me of a rectangle. Or this flag reminds me of a triangle. And this is a children's book that kind of walks through an example of that in a city. If you don't have access to this book, you can search it on YouTube, and there's examples of people reading it. So it's another way to access the content of this book. One small thing that might be worth sort of pointing out, or it's kind of a big thing, but you don't need to make a huge deal out of it with your kid, but is that, you know, a door is not a rectangle. A door is actually three-dimensional, and so it's different than a rectangle. In math, when we imagine a rectangle, it's a flat, perfectly flat, two-dimensional object with perfectly straight lines that all come together at exactly right angles. So there's a little bit of a difference between our mathematical imagination of a shape and what we might see in the real world. So I would tend to use language like, yeah, that door reminds me of a rectangle, especially the front of it. How is it different from a rectangle? And so maybe talking about some of those kinds of things to keep in mind or help the kid keep in mind the fact that there is a difference between the mathematical object and things we see in our world. Finally, if you want to explore shape with your kids, another great activity is which one doesn't belong. There's a link here and I'll put it in the description below as well. This website will have a bunch of different pictures like this, where there's 4 different shapes. And the question is, which one do you think doesn't belong and why? And there is no wrong answer to this question. In fact, we could come up with an answer for every single shape. And after a child gives their answer, we might say, what about this one? Can we come up with a reason why this one doesn't belong? And so it's not about, just like all these activities, not about finding the answer per se, but more about exploring shapes and talking about them and what you notice about them and what kinds of things you're seeing. And it's fine to share your own thinking also, just as long as you don't position it as more right or more correct than the kids' thinking, and just view them all as different ways of thinking about it. So that's my quick summary of what math in kindergarten looks like. If you want to see the first video, you can click and find that video about number. And this was a summary about shapes. If you have any questions, you want to talk more, please send me a message. I'm happy to talk.